Alright, so in the last video we created the bootstrap component for our navigation and our table. Now in this video what I want to do is I want to add a button as a new field in the table, and we're going to be linking that button to the details page where we can view the individual details of the players from the table. Alright, so I'm going to quickly head back to Visual Studio Code, and then we can generate a component for the detail. So I'm right here on Visual Studio Code. I'm going to bring back my terminal, and here I want a new component for the player detail. So we're going to generate the component with the CLI as usual. So ng g for generate, c for component, and we're going to put that in our components folder, and we're going to call the component player details. Details is good, and then we'll add the skip test flag because we don't want any unit test. So we have the player details component generated for us, and now we want to set the routing for that page. So let's go over to the routing page. So app.routing.module. Currently we just have one route that routes to the root of the page that displays the player component. Let's add another route to display the player detail. So path, and we want to give that route a name. Let's call it player. And to get the player detail we need the ID of the player. So in this route we'll be passing the ID of the player. So to pass the ID of the player you add a slash, and then you had a colon, and then the name of the parameter you want to pass. And this route should take us to our generated component, which is the player detail component. So player details component. Alright, that's good. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to get back that player from the database, and we can do that in our services. So let's head back to the players service, the TS. Here we have our first method that gets all the player. Now we want to add another one to get a single player. So let's call that get. You can call it whatever you want, and we want to pass in the ID of the player we want to get. So we're going to pass a string as a parameter, so ID of string. Okay, and then we're going to call the DB like this. And for the first one we use a list to get the list of all the objects, but to get a single object you're going to use an object just like that. And we want to pass in the player interface and also our URL. So for the URL it's going to be /players. Then we're going to concatenate the ID of the player, so /player plus the ID right here. The ID here. Alright, and then we also want to do the snapshot changes as well, like we did before. And then we're going to pipe that over, pass it to a pipe, and use the map operator as well. Then we're going to get back data, let's call it X, and for the X we already have the ID, so we can do the same thing what we did before. So I can simply copy what we have here over and just paste that in. The only difference is that X right here is not an array like the other one, so it doesn't have this map operator like the other one. So what we want to do is, let me just take that away. So we want to do return the object directly like this without passing it through anything. So we're going to say the ID would be s dot, you see here we have direct access to the payload without using any y variable, because for this is a list, why this is a single object, so you can just do s dot payload here. So we're going to do s dot payload dot id to get the id of that player. Just that we need an optional there. Okay, and then a comma, and then we concatenate s dot payload dot val to get the value as player. Okay, but we have an issue with the ID, and what does it say? ID property doesn't exist. Actually, it's not the ID now, it's the key. So we don't have an ID from a real-time database. We only have a key, that's the ID, so we want to use key. So ID is this and the payload is that. So with this method right here, we can get the player. Now we want to return it as an observable like we did for the first one, so we're going to do observable, and this time we're not returning it as a player array but just a single player. And there we have that error because we haven't used the return keyword. Alright, and now we have another issue, and like before we need to give it a data type for x, so we can just do s any, and that's how we fixed it before, and we don't need this semicolon here. Okay, this looks good. We can add the semicolon here if we want to. Alright, so this is our get method. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to call this get method from the service so that we can get the players. Just one thing I want to check is for our ID we have the player not like this, but we should concatenate the player like this with the plus, so ID. Okay, we're going to test that and see if it works. So we have our get method. Let's use our get method in the details component. So command P, let's go to player details component. Okay, so this is our player details component. So we want to inject our service private and we want to inject the player service, and then that's coming from the player service. Alright, I just realized I forgot to do something, so I'm going to head over back to our player component here, .html. This is where we are displaying that nice table, bootstrap table for the player. The first thing I should have done was add another field and get a link there that would navigate us to that player details page that we just created. So I want to use a TD here, not a TH. So TD, and here we want to have a link, and in my demonstration video I called it edit, but how about we call it details here? Not like that, but just details. Okay, so this is player details link, and this we want to go, we use the router link here, and we're going to set it equal to player then with the slash, and we can use our interpolation here, and we pass in player dot id here, because we have that id coming in from the database. So let's check this out and see if it works on the browser. And now we have this details link here. If I click on it, it takes me to the player slash the id, and I have it working here. So I have the id passed here, and we have players detail work. So one thing I don't like right now is that the button is just showing as a link. So let's format that as a button with bootstrap. So if I head over back, let's head over back here, and we want to give a class to this link so that it's formatted as a button. So we can do that with btn to make it a button, and for a dark button we can do btn dash dark, same way we did table dash dark to make it the heading of the table dark. So if I save that and I head over to the browser, you can see that our button now it's dark. So here it's showing details as of different from what I have in the preview, which was edit, but just you get the idea. It's a detail button that takes us here. So here we want to call our method from the service to get the details and display it here. So let's head back here to Visual Studio Code, and let's go to the player's details component. And right here we want to, when the page loads, we want to call that method. So this dot player service dot, as you can see, we have two methods there: get all, that gets all the players, and get that gets a single player. That's the one that we want. But this method here takes an id. Now how do we get this id? If you remember back here, when we call this detail, when we hit this detail button, it takes us to the other page, but when we get to the other page, we have the id here passed as a url parameter. So we can get this id from the url parameter with Angular. So let me quickly show you how to do that. So let's head over to Visual Studio Code, and we want to use another dependency, which will be our activated route. So private routes, and this is called activated route. So we're going to use this activated route to get that that route id. So to get that, let's make a variable here for the id. I'm going to call it id type with string, and let me just quickly initialize it to an empty string first. Okay, so I have that string variable, and I want to set that this dot id to be equal to, I'm going to use this dot route, which is what I'm getting from this activated route that Angular provides for us. And I'm going to go to the snapshot dot params, that's getting the parameters from the route, and there's a get, and here we want to get the id. So this would get us the id, and we want to check if the id is not null. If it's valid, then we want to use that id to call the service to get the data for that player. So I can pass the id here, this dot id, and then we can subscribe to that like we did with the other one. So subscribe, and we're going to get a player. For now I want to console log it, so I see if I get it or not. So I'm going to put a p here, and I'm going to save it, and try to run the program now. So this is our player detail. Let's go back here. We have the player, and let's hit the detail for the first one, Frank Lampard, and then let's head over to the console and let's see. Oops, we have an error. So that route.snapshot is not the right component to use. Okay, Docker, can we do that later? All right, let's head over back here. And yeah, so that's not, we shouldn't be using params. It should be params map or param map. Sorry about that. Param map, and then we want to get the ID. Yeah, so this is the one, param map that get ID. Now this is going to return a string or is going to return null. If I hover on the get here, it's going to return string or null, and we already set this ID to string. So for us to get rid of this error, we can set this to be union type, so string or null. Right, so that way we can get this here, and if this is not null, if it is a string, then we want to do this. All right, that looks good. I'll just add a semicolon here and let's try it again. So I'm going to head over to the browser, and as you can see, we have Frank Lampard here. If I close this, I go back here and let's try for Joe Cole. Players detail work. If I go to inspect and I check the console, and what do you know, we have Joe Cole here. All right, that looks good. So I'm going to close the console and head back to Visual Studio Code. Come on. Yeah. So head back here, and now we don't want to display this on the console anymore, but instead we want to create a variable for it to hold that data and then display it on the page. So let's name the field to hold that data. Let's call it player. I just want player, and that would be an object of player type. Right, so I can initialize this to be an empty object because I made all the fields to be optional, if you remember. And then I'm going to import this. Okay, so we have player, and instead of logging that player, we want to set that player to P. So this I'm going to set this dot player to be equal to P. Alright, so we're setting the player now to be P, and then we can go over to the HTML. So player and component.html right here, not this one, player details. Player details.component.html here. So this is where we want to display the player. All right, and we want to use a bootstrap card for that. So I'm going to create the card, div card, and then we want to have the header. So I'm going to use a h3 tag, and for the header I'm going to say card header. There you go. And then we want to add the first name, the last name of the player. So we already have that data in our player variable, so we can do player dot first name. Okay, and then we can also add the last name here, so we can also do player dot last name. All right, so we have that for the header, and then we also want to add to the body the other detail. So I'm going to say dot card body, and let me just make the last one here dot card footer. Okay, so we have the header. I'm using an h3, the h3 tag for the header, and also a div for the body and div for the footer. So for the body, we're going to have a list group inside, so an unordered list, and let's give it a class of list group. And we're going to have different items inside, so li for the item, and we give it a class of list group item. Okay, and let's say the first one is age, and I can put the age here with player.age, and I can just copy this and paste it 2 times. I have the age, country. This would be player.country, and the last one is the position. Just capitalize this, and the last one is the position. So position, player.position. Okay, and finally for the footer, I want the button group, so I'm going to do btn dash group, so I'll get the div for that, and I need 2 buttons, so I want one for the edit and one for delete. For the edit, I need to route to a different page to do that, so I can use a link and format it as a button like before. So btn dash, what class should I use? Let's stick to dark. Okay, and for the button, we can do button, and we give it the class btn dash, let's do danger for a red button, and then the button we'll call it delete, and the other one we'll call it edit. Alright, we're going to save this and check how it looks like on the browser, and yeah, this is what we did. So you have the name here, you have the edit and the delete button. So you have the table here, and if you go to the details, let's say Fernando Torres, you see the name here, the age, country, position, and you have those buttons, the edit and delete. So the next thing we want to do is we want to create another component for the edit. So when I click on that, it takes me to the edit page, and we can edit the player. So since we are starting out with form, maybe we can also add the player and the edit. So I'm thinking which one I should do next, but I'm going to start with add the player. So let's work on the add the player. We're going to add the form module to our project, and then we're going to add a form. So I'll do that in the next video.